Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away. The systems behind the games, the contracts hidden inside victory, the lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the capital relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. Katniss Everdeen stands on the balcony, bow drawn, every eye in Panem waiting for one clean shot. Snow is tied to the post, broken, bleeding. The monster of the games finally within range. You can almost feel the entire capital holding its breath, expecting the story to end the way revenge fantasies always do. The tyrant dies. The hero pulls the trigger. Roll credits. Instead, she turns. The arrow flies upward and cuts through President Coin. In 1 second, the ending you thought you understood collapses. So here's the real question. If Snow is the obvious villain, why does the narrative end with Katniss assassinating the woman who just saved Panem? Why does the final shot skip the man who poisoned a generation and land on the leader of the rebellion instead? At face value, Coin is everything the districts were promised. She shelters the refugees from 12. She funds the Propos. She arms the rebels and sends them into the capital streets. If you only watch the highlight reel, she looks like the answer to Snow. Order instead of chaos. Structure instead of spectacle. A president who talks about democracy instead of a president who sells children as entertainment. But this is where we talk about intent. Snow wanted control and didn't bother to hide it. His games are a televised threat. Obey or your children die on screen. Coin wants the same control, but she wraps it in survival, justice, and for the people. District 13 runs on strict schedules tattooed onto your skin. Rations, curfews, punishments. On paper, it's about staying alive underground. In practice, it trains you to accept that every second of your day belongs to the president. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when you win. Under Coin, they don't end when you rebel. Either Snow weaponizes the arena, Coin weaponizes the Propo. He broadcasts kids killing each other. She broadcasts their trauma back to the districts and calls it truth. Both are playing for narrative control. The only real difference is the branding. And that part matters because of the choice she offers at the end, a symbolic final Hunger Games using capital children. That vote is the mask slipping. After everything, Coin's solution to systemic cruelty is a better managed sequel. Not justice, not reconciliation. Just a more efficient, more sustainable Snow. So why did Katniss have to kill her in that exact moment? There is a lot to uncover here. Coin needed Snow alive long enough to unite the districts against him. Prim dead to sever Katniss's last tether to hope. And Katniss herself disposable the second the Mockingjay stopped being convenient. In the next section, we're going to cover how Coin's long game made her the one enemy Panem couldn't afford to survive. From monster to martyr, why replacing Snow was never the real victory. So when Katniss kills Coin instead of Snow, that isn't a twist ending. It's the logical conclusion to a war that never actually ended. Back in Snow's early games era, the horror is obvious. You have the arena, the public executions disguised as entertainment, the yearly reminder that the capital can take your children and turn their deaths into a party. The enemy is clear. Snow doesn't hide the relationship between your suffering and his power. He televises it. At face value, overthrowing that monster should feel like victory. But then Coin steps up onto the platform in the ruins of the capital and starts talking about liberation. So why does it feel wrong? Why does District 13, the supposed heart of the resistance, run on strict schedules, grey uniforms, and punishments that look suspiciously familiar? Why do you trade Snow's roses for Coin's numbered bunk assignments and survival lectures? There is a lot to uncover here. Walk through 13's daily life. You're scanned, tracked, assigned, rationed. Coin's people tell you it's all for survival, for justice, for the future. Snow said almost the same thing, just with better lighting and worse honesty. He used the language of peace and order. She uses the language of survival and justice. Different words, same result. Centralized power with a moral story wrapped around it. And here's the real question. If this is freedom, why is the Mockingjay on a leash? Coin keeps Katniss alive only after Plutarch convinces her that Katniss is more useful as a symbol than as a martyr. That part matters because victors in Panem are never beneficiaries. They're tools. The Hunger Games turned tributes into spectacle. Coin's propo turned Katniss into a weaponized narrative. Either way, you win the games or the war, and then someone higher up decides how your face sells their promise of hope. This is where we talk about the rebranding of victory. In Panem, winning doesn't mean the system is over, it means the system needs a new coat of paint. Snow builds Victor's village to pretend a victor has escaped the games. Coin builds the Mockingjay to pretend a soldier has escaped control. But why does Katniss still get orders? Why is she deployed to photo ops instead of actually being set free? The answer shows up in the so-called symbolic final Hunger Games. When Coin proposes using capital children as tributes, she reveals that she doesn't want to end the games. She wants to own them. Retribution instead of justice. New victims, same arena. Why end a perfect tool for fear and unity when you can rename it and claim the moral high ground? And that's the real danger. The dictator you overthrow is rarely the last one. It's the one who can step into the vacuum with cleaner hands and a better story. Coin auditions for that role from day one. In the next section, we're going to cover how her polished version of tyranny could have become even more stable than Snow's, and why Katniss had one shot to stop it. Our thesis: Coin as the better dictator Panem almost chose. So here's the twist this whole video is built on. Snow is the villain you're trained to hate. Our thesis is pretty simple, but the implications are huge. Snow is the visible tyrant, roses, blood, and televised games that scream, "This is oppression." Coin is the optimized version of that same system, upgraded for durability. She takes Snow's machinery of control, strips off the decadence, and sells it back to the districts as progress, survival, and justice. At face value, that sounds unfair to Coin, right? She's bombing the capital, she's feeding refugees, she's promising elections. But here's the real question. If the daily schedule in District 13 looks suspiciously like a prison timetable, if every citizen is tracked, rationed, and punished under the language of collective duty, how different is that relationship of power from the capitals? The uniforms are drabber, the speeches are flatter, but the core promise is the same. Obey, and maybe you'll live. This isn't a coin bad, Snow good reversal. Snow is absolutely monstrous. This is where we talk about evolution. Authoritarian systems don't usually disappear. They adapt. Snow knows he's a tyrant. He doesn't pretend the games are fair. He just insists they're necessary. Coin is more dangerous because she believes she's righteous. When you're convinced you're the hero of Panem, every atrocity becomes a tragic necessity, every dead child a step toward lasting peace. That part matters because a villain with a guilty conscience has limits. A liberator with a clean conscience doesn't. We're going to cover how Coin keeps Katniss alive only after Plutarch convinces her that Katniss is more useful as a symbol than as a martyr. Snow uses the games to terrify the districts. Coin uses Katniss's propo to inspire them. Different aesthetics, same tactic. Weaponize a girl's trauma on camera to control the narrative. So the lens for the rest of this breakdown is going to be a direct comparison across 5 dimensions. Control tactics. Snow's fear and luxury versus Coin's schedules and rations. Propaganda. Snow's glittering broadcasts versus Coin's gritty truth reels. Use of Katniss as a rebellious tribute versus a Mockingjay mascot. Approach to violence. Open spectacle in the arena versus surgical strikes that still kill Prim. Long-term political strategy. Snow's hereditary rule versus Coin's temporary presidency that somehow keeps expanding. Running under all of this is one ethical question. Is a dictator who admits they're a tyrant less dangerous than one who insists they're a liberator? When Coin proposes a symbolic final Hunger Games using capital children, she isn't breaking from Snow's world. She's renewing the contract with better branding. The games don't end, they just change targets. And there is a lot to uncover here, from Coin needing Snow alive long enough to unify the districts, to the exact way Prim dies in a double bomb strategy both sides use, to that final vote for another Hunger Games. Every move is part of her audition to be Panem's next permanent president. The real tension is this. By the time Katniss realizes it, does she still have a way to win a game that never officially started? Roadmap. How will prove Coin was the real endgame boss? So to answer that question, we need a roadmap, because Coin doesn't walk on stage twirling a mustache. She builds her endgame move by move, system by system, until suddenly Snow isn't the scariest person in the room anymore. First, we're going to cover Snow's rule the way the districts actually experience it. Not just evil president loves roses, but the mechanics, fear, spectacle, and that one central ritual that holds everything together, the Hunger Games. At face value, the games are punishment and entertainment. But we'll break down why putting all your power into one yearly bloodbath is a fragile strategy. What happens when the symbol you use to terrify the districts becomes the thing that unites them instead? This is where we talk about the cracks in Snow's system, his dependence on televised suffering, on victors as trophies, on the promise that the games will always mean the same thing. We'll track how Katniss, The arena glitches, and even the quarter quell twists start turning his own tools against him. That part matters, because it sets the bar. Snow is horrible, yes, but also limited. You can see the cage he builds. Then we move underground. District 13. On the surface, it's the anti-capital. No excess, no parties, no games. Freedom. Right? Here's the real question. Why does freedom come with colorless uniforms, military schedules down to the minute, and punishments for missing a meal bell? We'll walk through Coin's system, rationing, bunk assignments, the way every citizen's day is printed on their arm. You're not watching the games anymore, but you're still being timed, counted, and managed. We'll also dig into the propos. Snow weaponizes arenas, Coin weaponizes cameras. Same tool, different branding. We'll compare how both leaders frame Katniss, Snow as the dangerous spark to be contained, Coin as the perfect symbol to be posed, scripted, and wheeled out on command. The question isn't whether she's kinder, it's why both systems need a girl on fire to keep their people in line. From there, we go long game. Coin keeping Snow alive just long enough to unify the districts against a common enemy. Coin benefiting when Prim dies in a bombing strategy that mirrors Snow's own tactics. Coin treating Katniss not as a victor to be freed, but as a volatile asset to be steered or removed. There is a lot to uncover here about intention versus opportunity. And then we hit the mask slip moment, the vote for a symbolic final Hunger Games on Capitol children. We'll slow that scene down, line by line, to show how that single proposal exposes Coin's real relationship to power and revenge. If she believes in the games at all, even once, what does that say about the future she's building? Finally, we'll end by jumping forward 5, 10, 20 years into a Panem that never gets Katniss's arrow in the snow-white rose garden. We'll sketch what Coin's presidency realistically becomes. More efficient than Snow, more stable, and in some ways more terrifying because it would all feel earned. The war is over. The bad man is gone. So why does the cage suddenly feel permanent? By the end, you won't just know that Coin was dangerous, you'll know exactly how close Panem came to trading one set of games for another and never realizing it. Welcome to Victor's Village of dictators, so before we go any deeper into Coin's endgame, we need to zoom out for a second. Because if you're new here, you just dropped into the middle of an ongoing argument in Victor's Village about which president is the worst neighbor. Snow with the poisoned roses, or Coin with the It's For Your Own Good curfew. This channel lives in that space. We dive into all things Hunger Games, books, movies, obscure lore, and all the messy political questions Suzanne Collins hides under flaming dresses and Mockingjay wings. At face value, it's a YA series about televised murder. But here's the real question. Why does a story about a girl with a bow end up being one of the sharpest breakdowns of power, propaganda, and trauma you've ever read? If you've seen the earlier videos, you know we're going to cover way more than who wins the games. We've already pulled apart how the arena is basically a weaponized laboratory, how District 13's bunker culture runs on schedules that feel suspiciously prison-adjacent, and how Katniss's trauma turns her into the perfect symbol and the worst obedient soldier at the same time. There is a lot to uncover here when you start asking why every reward in Panem looks suspiciously like a new cage. Tone-wise, the promise here is simple. We stay curious, analytical, but still fun and conversational, more gossiping in the victor's village kitchen about your fascist HOA president than dry political science lecture. We'll talk about the relationship between Snow's roses and Coin's grey jumpsuits with the same energy we use to argue whether District 4 or District 2 has the more cursed Victor's Village block party. This is where we talk about the tiny details: who stands where on a balcony, who gets a private train car, that quietly decide who lives and who becomes a cautionary tale. So if you're into this kind of deep dive into Panem's power structures, you might want to stick around, because we're not done with Coin, Snow or Rebellion anytime soon. We've got breakdowns coming on District 13's democracy votes, the ethics of Coin's propo versus Snow's broadcasts, and even how the promise of safety for a victor's family becomes the sharpest knife the capital ever forged. If that sounds interesting, consider camping out here in Victor's Village with us. But to really understand why Coin was so dangerous, we need to go backward, before the roses, before the white suits, back to a boy in a collapsing capital, counting food rations and realizing that fear can be engineered. Next, we're going into Snow's origin story, how his particular brand of villainy built a world where someone like Coin doesn't just rise. She feels inevitable. And that part matters because once you see how Snow designs the first cage, you'll understand exactly how Coin planned to weld the door shut forever. Snow's empire, the visible cage everyone could see. Snow's world is simple. You're either on top in the capital, or you're in a district praying your name doesn't come out of a glass bowl. At face value, Panem under Snow is almost brutally straightforward. 12 districts ringed around a glittering center, each one locked into a single industry so narrow you can't breathe outside it. District 12 digs. District 4 fishes. District 7 cuts trees until there's nothing left but stumps and sawdust. All of it flows inward to feed the capital's parties, gowns, and genetically engineered roses. And every year, the same ritual: the Hunger Games as national holiday, punishment, and reminder of who lost the last war. 2 children from each district march to the train station in front of everyone, turned into a televised blood sport that the capital calls entertainment. Terror, but with good costume design. Here's the real question: why make the cruelty so obvious? Why not hide the executions, soften the language, pretend this is about justice? Snow doesn't bother. His main tools are designed to be seen. Peacekeepers with guns in the square, whippings in the street, gallows and firing squads that don't happen in basements but in public view. Starvation does the rest. You don't have to read a law book to understand the relationship between empty shelves and capital control. When tesserae grain is the only thing between your siblings and death, you will sign away your child's odds in the reaping without needing a speech from Snow. And then there are the games themselves, the most efficient weapon he ever built. Children become victims and weapons at the same time. They kill each other, but they also kill the district's ability to unify. How do you organize a rebellion with District 2 when their victor just stabbed your tribute on live TV? Snow doesn't just punish you, he makes you blame the other districts for your grief. But this is where we talk about visibility. Everyone knows the cage exists. District citizens know they're enslaved. They watch their kids disappear into the arena and never come back. Tributes know they're props for the capital's story. Even capital citizens, high on parties and perfumes, feel the edge of fear. One wrong word, and you go from audience to example. That part matters, because it's also Snow's weakness. His system depends on everyone watching the games. The spectacle has to hold. The minute a tribute like Katniss turns that spectacle into a symbol of resistance, the berries, the salute, Rue's flowers, the weapon misfires on live television. Hope, the thing Snow thought he could ration, starts leaking into every district screen. So why does this set Coin up to be even worse? Snow's cage is made of iron bars you can point at. Whips, fences, arenas. Coin watches that fail in real time and takes notes. We're going to cover how she keeps the schedules, the rules, even the bombings, but strips away the roses and the honesty. Snow needs you afraid of him. Coin wants you to believe you're finally safe. And that's a much harder cage to see or escape once the games change names but never actually end. Hope versus Fear 1.0, Snow's original operating system. Snow actually tells you the operating system out loud. In that garden scene with Seneca Crane, surrounded by roses and blood-red punch, he doesn't rant about cruelty or power. He talks about hope. He says fear is the only thing stronger than hope, but that a little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. At face value, it sounds almost philosophical. But here's the real question. What kind of leader treats hope as a dosage problem? This is where we talk about the games as a calibration machine. Every year, the Capitol broadcasts horror to every district. Children hunting each other, mutts, cannons. That's your fear. That's the reminder that the Capitol can reach into your home and take your child. But then, one tribute survives. One victor gets the crown, the wealth, the house, the supposed escape from the reaping. That part matters because it plants exactly one thought in every watching mind. Maybe, if the odds are ever in my favor, it could be me. Snow is not trying to erase hope, he's curating it. Most tributes die in ways that make you want to crawl out of your own skin. But the cameras linger on the feast, the makeover, the reunion with family. The games are structured so the terror feels inevitable, but the reward feels barely attainable, just enough to keep you participating. You're terrified of the arena, but you still send your children to the reaping in pressed clothes. Because what if they're the one who wins? And once someone does win, Snow doesn't file them away. He puts them on tour. Victors become walking billboards that the system works. They go district to district, smiling from train balconies, delivering speeches written in the Capitol, repeating the promise that obedience can be rewarded. Their trauma is never allowed to heal, because their nightmares are part of the product. You watch Haymitch drunk on stage, Finnick weaponized as a sex symbol, Katin forced into an engagement. We're going to cover how Victor's village fits into this, but the core relationship is already clear. The victor is proof that the cage can be comfortable if you stop fighting the bars. Snow is disturbingly honest about his role. He never claims to be a liberator. He says order must be maintained. He uses public executions, whippings, hunger. But he understands something a cartoon villain wouldn't. Terror alone burns out. If people have nothing to lose, they stop playing by your rules. So he drip feeds hope through victors, sponsorships, tiny chances at survival. Now imagine someone who learns that exact equation, agrees with it, and then wraps it in the language of freedom. Someone who doesn't build arenas, but still believes in symbolic games. If Snow is the tyrant who tells you he's dangerous, what happens when Coin takes the same math and convinces you it's justice? We've seen Snow's original operating system. Next, we have to watch Coin install the upgrade. District 13, the underground capital with better PR. If Snow is the old operating system, District 13 is the sleek new interface. Same code running underneath. Very different wallpaper. You wake up in 13 and your day is already decided. Not metaphorically, your schedule is literally tattooed on your arm. Wake, report, work, meals, drills, sleep. Every block assigned, every minute accounted for. Miss a shift? Question an order. That's not a quirky personality trait. That's a disciplinary issue. At face value, this all sounds reasonable. You're underground. Resources are scarce. Of course, food is rationed. Of course, there are mandatory air raid drills. Of course, there's a rigid command structure. Survival, right? But here's the real question. If a system controls where you are, what you eat, and what you do from dawn to lights out, how different does it feel from the capital's control on the surface? In the capital, the games schedule your life. Fashion dictates your body. Entertainment pipelines your emotions. You're told when to watch, when to cheer, when to mourn the latest dead victor. In 13, there are no feathers or dyed skin, but the effect is similar. You're still an input in someone else's machine. The capital sells pleasure and distraction. 13 sells necessity and discipline. Both demand obedience. This is where we talk about Coin's rhetoric, because that part matters because it's the main rebrand. Snow never pretends he's one of you. Coin does. She stands in front of the district, hair grey, clothes plain, and talks about sacrifice, duty, the greater good. She frames every order as something she wishes she didn't have to give. The reluctant leader, the one who does what must be done so you don't have to. We're going to cover the visual contrast because the visuals are the trap. Snow has his white roses, his parties, his blood on the carpet. You can point at his decadence and say, there, that's the problem. Coin strips all of that away. No parties, no silk, no champagne, just concrete, schedules, and a cafeteria line. It feels honest. It feels morally superior, but the power still flows one way, up. So why does that work on you, on Katniss, on almost every district? Because we confuse aesthetic with ethics. We see Snow's luxury and assume that's the reason he's corrupt. We see Coin's austerity and assume that means she's fair. When in reality, both leaders reserve the right to decide who eats, who fights, and who dies in the name of stability. Here's the real question. If the rules over your body and time feel the same, but the branding changes from pleasure to survival, are you actually freer? Or are you just more willing to cooperate because the story sounds noble? Hold on to that, because next we have to watch what happens when Coin gets her own version of the games. Pattern interrupt. What if Coin is the good Snow Panem was ready to love? So when Coin gets her own version of the games, we expect a mirror of Snow. What if that's the wrong comparison? What if she isn't Snow 2.0 inches in the sense of equal evil, but the upgraded model the districts would actually tolerate? Here's the real question. If Snow is the monster you can see, Roses and blood and televised arenas. Is Coin the monster you vote for because she promises order, justice, and no more children in the arena, eventually? At face value, Snow is easier to hate. He smells of blood and roses. He drinks to hide the sores in his mouth. He stands in front of the Capitol and practically purrs while children die on screen. You don't have to do moral calculus there. You just recoil. Coin? Coin wears grey. Coin talks about schedules, rations, the survival of the species. She doesn't sell pleasure, she sells necessity. That part matters because people will endure almost anything if you tell them it's the only reason their district is still alive. Snow's cruelty is visible. Coin's cruelty is justified. That's the shift. You see it in how each one uses a camera. Snow turns the games into a spectacle. He wants you dazzled and horrified. Coin turns Katniss into a propo machine. She wants you inspired and obedient. Both are weaponizing suffering, but one calls it entertainment and the other calls it truth. This is where we talk about the good dictator trope. The leader who says, we have to centralize power for now, only until things are safe, only until the Capitol can't hurt you again. It sounds reasonable, it sounds temporary, but somehow the emergency never ends. We've seen versions of this outside Panem too. You don't need specific names to recognize the pattern. A crisis hits, harsh measures arrive, freedoms shrink, and people accept it because the alternative is framed as chaos, crime, or war. There is a lot to uncover here about our relationship to fear and control. Coin is built for that script. She doesn't want to be adored the way Snow does. She wants to be necessary. She doesn't need you to love her. She just needs you to believe there is no safe world without her hand on the controls. And the scary part, that works, especially on a population that has already been through the games, bombings, starvation, and the destruction of entire districts. So we're going to cover Coin not as the rebel president who went too far, but as the version of Snow Panem was finally ready to accept. Efficient, self-righteous, publicly palatable. Next, we'll test that theory by walking through her choices one by one, keeping Katniss alive as a symbol, copying Snow's bombing tactics in the Capitol, and that chilling proposal for a symbolic final Hunger Games. Because once you see the pattern, the question stops being, is Coin as bad as Snow, and becomes, how close did Panem come to choosing her on purpose? Katniss the pawn, Snow's mockingjay versus Coin's weapon. So when we say Coin kept Katniss alive as a symbol, we need to ask a sharper question. What kind of symbol did each president actually want? Because Snow and Coin are playing the same game with very different end goals for the girl on fire. Under Snow, Katniss is a problem first, a symbol second. He threatens her family, and Peter, yes, but notice the shape of that relationship. He never pretends he owns her. He treats her as a dangerous variable he has to manage, not a puppet he can fully control. That part matters because it tells you how he understands power. Snow's strategy is old school Capitol. Fear, spectacle, personal leverage. He wants her to play the star-crossed lover, to sell the narrative that the games are brutal but fair, that a clever romantic victor can still win a future. You remember his visit to her house in Victor's village, the White Rose. The implied promise, keep up the performance, and maybe your district survives. Here's the real question. Why doesn't he just kill her after the berries stunt? Because for Snow, Katniss isn't content. She's a pressure valve. If she smiles on camera, Mentors in the arena plays the compliant victor. The wider system stabilizes. He's terrified of her precisely because he can't script her. So he tries to fence her in with threats instead. Now shift underground to District 13, and the temperature drops. Coin's first instinct isn't to manage Katniss. It's to erase her. We're told outright that Coin initially wants her dead, seeing her as a rival symbol who could split the rebellion. She only backs off when Plutarch argues Katniss is more useful alive, as a face for the cause. At face value, they're truthful broadcasts exposing capital cruelty. But watch how Coin's team uses them. They script Katniss's lines, they stage battle footage from the hospital in District 8 to the singing in 12's ruins. They edit reality, cutting away breakdowns, doubts, and inconvenient questions, so the rebellion has a clean, righteous heroine. Under Coin, Katniss stops being a person with agency and becomes a production. She's not writing the story of the war, she's being dropped into scenes. Coin wants a symbol who can't talk back, because the narrative itself is the real weapon she's building. And here's the disturbing symmetry. Snow turns tributes into entertainment. Under the banner of the games, Coin turns Katniss into propaganda under the banner of truth. Different costumes, same stage. One sells you fear of the capital, the other sells you hope in the districts. But in both cases, the human at the center is disposable. So which is more dangerous? The tyrant who threatens your life, or the leader who quietly edits you out of your own story? Hold that question, because next we're going to cover the moment Coin pushes this logic to its limit. On a snowy capital street with a double bombing and a medic named Prim at the center. Bombs, propos, and Prim. Coin's calculated cruelty. So we end up on that snowy capital street, and suddenly Coin's philosophy isn't theoretical anymore. It's shrapnel. It's smoke. It's Prim. At face value, the bombing looks simple. The capital has lost the war, Snow is cornered in his mansion, and in a last cruel move, his forces drop silver parachutes onto a crowd of capital children at the palace gates. You've seen these parachutes before in the games, right? They promise help, medicine, hope. The kids rush in. Children are torn apart. The second wave of bombs waits just long enough for medics to sprint forward. Among them, Prim, now a trained healer from District 13, wearing the same white that once signaled safety in the arena. More parachutes explode. Responders die. The tactic is textbook capital cruelty, a trap designed to punish compassion. But here's the real question. Whose textbook are we actually reading from? There is a lot to uncover here, because in the books we learn about a specific kind of weapon Gale and Beatty design in 13, a delayed secondary explosion meant to hit rescuers. The exact pattern we see at the gates. Snow later tells Katniss it wasn't his order, and disturbingly, the evidence lines up with him for once. The capital's air defenses were compromised. Rebel hovercraft were in the sky. The bombs mirror 13's own schematics. So why would Snow copy a weapon he barely had time to see tested in the final hours of his rule? This is where we talk about motive. Coin gains everything from this strike. Politically, it's perfect. The horror of dead capital children unites the districts in a final cleansing rage. Any lingering sympathy for civilians in the capital evaporates. The blast also clears out Snow's remaining loyalists, clustered at his mansion, making the physical transfer of power smoother. And crucially, it destroys Katniss's last emotional anchor. That part matters because Katniss's relationship to the war has always been conditional. Protect Prime, and she plays the Mockingjay. Kill Prim, and the whole bargain collapses. Coin doesn't need a stable victor after the war. She needs a broken symbol during it. A Katniss who will show up for one last execution, then quietly self-destruct. Watch how Coin responds. While Katniss is catatonic, Coin is calm, controlled, already outlining a plan for justice and a new government. She calls for a vote on a symbolic final Hunger Games using capital children right when everyone is traumatized and desperate for order. It feels participatory. It's actually choreography. So if Coin is willing to bomb children, including the sister of her own propaganda weapon, just to script a cleaner revolution, what wouldn't she justify for the new Panem? Hold on to that, because next we're going to cover how her proposed games reveal the endgame she never says out loud. The ethics of spectacle, Snow's games versus Coin's truth. Coin's bombing strategy tells you she'll script a massacre for effect. Snow's entire regime tells you he'll televise it. This is where we talk about spectacle. Under Snow, the Hunger Games never pretend to be anything else. They are literally called the Games. Flashy chariots, flaming costumes, stylized mutts, and Caesar Flickerman grinning as he recaps children murdering each other. At face value, it's punishment for rebellion and a reminder of the Capitol's power. But the Capitol audience isn't watching a trial. They're watching a season premiere. You get the sense that if Snow could have sold action figures of Cato and Glimmer, he would have. That part matters because it's honest in a very twisted way. Everyone in Panem understands the relationship. The Capitol enjoys, the districts suffer. The cameras are there to entertain and to threaten. No one's pretending this is journalism. Now jump to Coin. District 13 doesn't do sequins and Caesar, it does propose. Handheld footage of bombed-out districts, Katniss walking through ashes, close-ups of wounded bodies, emotional speeches about justice, unity, and a new Panem. We're going to cover how Coin mirrors Snow's tactics later. But here's the real question. Why does this feel so different when structurally it's the same move? Because Coin wraps her spectacle in the promise of truth. The propos are cut to look raw and unfiltered. Katniss singing the hanging tree, the camera lingering just long enough on her shaking hands, then cutting to uprisings in other districts as if her song directly ignites them. We know there is a lot to uncover here, because Plutarch literally restages scenes when Katniss doesn't give them enough usable emotion. They film her in the hospital with the wounded. They keep rolling when she breaks down. Then they edit. Snow packages suffering as a show. Coin packages suffering as news and inspiration. But in both cases, real pain is a tool. The dead in District 8, the corpses in the nut, Rue's body, Prim's body, they all become images to move an audience toward whatever outcome the person in power wants. The question isn't whether the footage is real, it's whether the narrative is. Here's the ethical twist. Coin can claim the moral high ground because her cause is just. She's fighting the Capitol. She's ending the games. So when she stages Katniss's appearances, or times a bombing to maximize emotional impact, who's going to call that out? In a war for survival, complaining about propaganda almost sounds ungrateful. That's what makes Coin's spectacle more insidious. When you know you're watching a show, you keep a little distance. Capital citizens can pretend it's all fun and fashion, but deep down, they know the games are curated. When you're told you're watching truth, you lower your guard. You accept the edits as reality. You let someone else decide which deaths matter. And Coin is counting on that, because once your sense of truth is on her side, it's a very small step to accepting whatever justice she defines next, including a brand new version of the games. Hook, checkpoint. Would you vote for Coin's justice? So when Coin stands up in that council room and calmly suggests a symbolic final Hunger Games, she's cashing in on all of that. Your sense of truth, your hunger for justice, your exhaustion. Snow is finished, the capital has fallen, and the surviving victors are seated around that table. Instead of announcing the end of the games forever, Coin proposes one more round. Not with district children, with capital children, the sons and daughters of the people who cheered while yours died. At face value, that sounds almost fair. You take what the capital did and flip it. One last spectacle, then peace. Coin even frames it as a vote, which makes it feel democratic. But here's the real question. If you were sitting in that chair with your own trauma in the room, how would you vote? This is where we talk about temptation, not theory. Imagine you're a victor from District 2 whose little brother died in the arena, or a parent from District 11 who watched Rue's games on a broken screen, then watched the peacekeepers gun down anyone who cried too loudly. You've carried that for years. You watched the capital children grow up safe, fed, entertained by your pain. Coin is offering you something the districts have never had, the power to make them feel it back. Would you be tempted to say yes, even just once? Just this one time so they finally understand? There is a lot to uncover here, because Coin doesn't sell this as cruelty. She sells it as closure, as the necessary propo finale that will balance the scales before she retires the games forever. That part matters because it's exactly how you turn revenge into policy. You don't call it vengeance, you call it healing. You don't say, we're continuing the games. You say we're ending them the right way. She's using the same structure Snow used, public suffering, as a tool of control, but she wraps it in the promise of justice and shared pain. And in the moment, it probably feels emotionally satisfying. You can almost hear the internal monologue. They did it to us for 75 years. We're only doing it once. That ratio feels reasonable when you're angry. That's the danger. Once you accept the principle that some children can be sacrificed for a narrative of justice, you've already agreed to Snow's original premise. Coin just changed the target. So here's what we're going to cover next. What that vote actually reveals about each victor at the table, and why Katniss's choice in that moment is way more complicated than she turned into Snow. For now, hold on to the question. If you had lived through those games, what would your vote be? Think about it, because Coin is counting on exactly that answer. Snow's end, why killing him wasn't enough. So let's follow that vote straight to the execution square. When we finally see Snow again, he's not the serpent on the throne. He's caged. Coughing blood, no white rose, no glass of red wine, no carefully curated image, just an old man in a greenhouse prison, literally surrounded by the wreckage of his own capital. At face value, you've already won. The tyrant is disarmed, the games are over, the districts have their victory. But here's the real question. If Snow is already chained, already scheduled to die, what does killing him actually change? The new regime stages his end as catharsis. The districts flood the avenue, packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for a public execution that feels very familiar. A single body in the center, a crowd watching, a spectacle framed as justice. You're supposed to feel that old promise from the games in reverse. One death to pay for years of suffering, one target so everyone else can go home believing the ledger is balanced. There is a lot to uncover here, because politically, Snow is finished before Katniss ever steps onto that balcony. His guards answer to Coin. His image is already being rewritten in the propo. The capital's media machine has been seized and pointed at him. By the time he's tied to that post, he's not a president. He's a prop. The real question isn't whether he dies. It's who gets to stand above him when he does, and on what terms they inherit his power. That part matters because focusing every ounce of rage on Snow is incredibly convenient for Coin. If all evil lives in one man, then the system around him gets to walk away clean. The strict schedules in District 13, the bombing strategies, the willingness to sacrifice children, those become unfortunate necessities, not part of the same machinery. Coin can step forward as the clean victor, the woman who ended the monster, while quietly preserving the relationship between spectacle and control that kept Snow in charge. So why does Katniss hesitate? Why doesn't the arrow just fly the way everyone expects? This is where we talk about the balcony twist. Katniss has watched Prim die in a double-tap bombing that mirrors Snow's own tactics. She's heard Snow calmly tell her he didn't order that attack. She's seen Coin propose a symbolic final Hunger Games on capital children with the same cold logic Snow used to defend the originals. In that moment, she understands the pattern. Swap the face, keep the structure. If she kills Snow on cue, the crowd screams. Coin smiles, and the games never really end. They just move upstairs. So when she draws the bow, she's not choosing between mercy and vengeance. She's choosing which future gets a head start. And the person she actually kills, that's the real proof of who she thinks is more dangerous. We're going to cover that choice next, and why almost everyone in Panem misreads it. Coin's long game, why she needed Snow alive, and Katniss broken. But here's the real question. How do you get to a moment where killing Snow isn't actually the most dangerous option in the room? This is where we talk about Coin's long game. At face value, any rebel leader should want Snow dead yesterday. Public enemy number one. Decades of games. Countless dead across every district. But Coin doesn't rush. She doesn't storm the mansion and put a bullet in his head the second she can. Why? Because a living Snow is worth more to her than a dead one. As long as he's breathing, he's the perfect before picture. The embodiment of the old order she can theatrically replace at just the right dramatic moment. There is a lot to uncover here because keeping Snow alive does something else too. It keeps the anger clean. As long as Snow exists, the rebels' hatred points in one direction, up at the capital monster not sideways at the new woman quietly consolidating power in District 13. If you execute him too early, you create a vacuum, and vacuums invite questions. Who's in charge now? What does justice look like? Coin does not want those questions until she has every camera, every soldier, and every traumatized victor lined up behind her. Which brings us to Katniss after the rescue. You'd think the Mockingjay would get full briefings, open access, real agency. Instead, Coin and Plutarch put her on a schedule that feels suspiciously close to Snow's system. Limited information, guarded movement, and missions that are less about military impact and more about the propos. Katniss is sent to the front only when the cameras are rolling, then yanked back the second she stops being photogenic hope and starts asking strategic why questions. That part matters because Coin doesn't actually want Katniss healed. She wants her raw, shaking, triggered by every siren and rose. An emotionally unstable Mockingjay is easier to direct, easier to aim. Someone that broken is less likely to sit in a war room and talk policy and more likely to stand on a platform and pull a trigger on command. A stable Katniss might start organizing victors, questioning Coin's punishments, asking what kind of relationship District 13 really plans to have with the capital after the war. Coin's ideal endgame is brutally simple. She keeps Snow alive just long enough to stage a public execution with maximum symmetry. The girl he tried to destroy becomes his executioner. The games end on screen with one last kill. Then, in Coin's perfect version, Katniss doesn't become a senator or a president. She fades into damaged obscurity. A spent symbol, too broken to threaten the new order, while Coin steps into uncontested power with clean hands. So why does Katniss refuse to finish that script? We're going to cover how one arrow breaks Coin's entire narrative and what that means for Panem's future. Next, District 13's democracy, choice without power. Katniss refuses because, on some level, she's already seen what Coin's Panem would feel like. You get a preview the second you wake up in District 13. There are councils, schedules, sign-up sheets. On paper, it looks almost comforting after the capital. People speak in meetings. There are votes. At face value, this isn't Snow's throne room. It's a conference room. That part matters because it's exactly how Coin sells herself as the reasonable alternative. But here's the real question. What are they actually allowed to decide? This is where we talk about agenda control. Coin doesn't need to rid every vote if she controls which questions ever make it into the room. She decides when there's a discussion, who gets invited, and how the options are framed. You see it in the propo. The council doesn't vote on whether Katniss should be turned into a weapon. They vote on how best to package her. The choice is never yes or no. It's which version of the same strategy serves Coin's long game. By the time we reach the Hunger Games vote, that pattern is fully weaponized. Coin calls a council, but it's not the districts. It's not even a broad leadership body. It's a tiny circle of victors whose trauma has been mined for years. Why them? Because their pain is the perfect shield. Look at the timing. Prim is dead. The capital has just fallen. Everyone is exhausted, grieving, desperate for a reason that makes the suffering mean something. Then Coin walks in and proposes a symbolic final games using capital children. Not a tribunal, not a truth commission, a spectacle. And she doesn't frame it as vengeance for herself, she wraps it in duty. This is to honor the dead districts, to give them justice, to balance the scales. So what are you really voting on in that room? Not policy, you're voting on whether you loved the fallen enough to hurt someone back for them. There is a lot to uncover here, because Coin has set up a no-win relationship between morality and loyalty. If the victors say no, they risk looking disloyal to the people who suffered. If they say yes, Coin walks away with the most valuable thing a dictator can have: plausible deniability. She didn't demand a new games, the victors did. She's just respecting their will. That's more insidious than Snow's open dictatorship. Under Snow, you know the games are his. The blood is on his roses. Under Coin, the blood is on everyone's hands. People feel they chose. They participated. And once you've voted for something, how much harder is it to stand up later and say it was wrong? So why does Katniss break the script at the last possible second? We're going to cover how that one Harrow is also a vote, and why it might be the only truly free choice anyone makes in the entire series. Next. Katniss's yes. The trap Coin walks right into. So when Katniss raises her hand and says yes to a new Hunger Games, it feels like the story just broke its own moral compass. You expect her to shut it down. She doesn't. At face value, that moment reads as betrayal. After everything she's suffered in the arena, after watching children die so the Capitol can feel safe, why would she endorse doing the same thing to Capitol kids? But here's the real question. Is she endorsing it? Or is she testing something? There is a lot to uncover here, because this is where we talk about Katniss as strategist, not just survivor. Look at where her head is. Prim is dead. Coin has just turned the victory celebration into a quiet coronation, standing above the other leaders on that weirdly elevated platform. Katniss is still choking on Snow's confession about the parachutes, and then Coin proposes a symbolic games wrapped in the language of justice and closure. If you're Katniss, how different does this really feel from the Capitol's "let's put on a show for peace" pitch? She's been living in District 13 long enough to feel the pattern, the schedules, the punishments, the way Coin uses propos, the same way Snow uses the games, to control the narrative of who's a hero and who's a threat. So when Coin smiles and offers this vote, Katniss is already suspicious. The new regime is starting to look eerily familiar, just with worse lighting and better slogans. So why say yes? Why not expose Coin right there and refuse? Because refusing would let Coin keep pretending. If Katniss says no, and the others still vote yes, Coin can frame herself as reluctantly bowing to the will of the victors and the districts. By saying yes, Katniss flips the trap. She gives Coin exactly what Coin secretly wants and watches what Coin does with it. That part matters because it confirms Coin's alignment with the games in front of everyone who counts. When Coin accepts the result, there's no hesitation, no visible grief, no sense of, "I hate this, but we must." She's relieved. She has cover. The woman who promised to end the Capitol's cruelty immediately reaches for the same weapon, just pointed in a different direction. Snow wanted control. Coin wants control with a clean conscience. From that point, Katniss has her answer. Coin isn't an overcautious general who made one bad call with the bombing strategy. She is a leader who believes in spectacle, in retributive pain, in keeping the games alive as a tool, so that yes becomes her first move in a different game, the balcony assassination. If Coin will continue the cycle, then removing Snow alone changes nothing. So when Katniss walks onto that balcony with one arrow and two presidents in her sights, whose death actually ends the games, and whose death would just reboot them with a new logo, we're going to cover how she makes that choice and why killing Coin is the only way to keep her yes from becoming permanent in the next section. Hope versus Fear 2.00, Coin's cleaner, colder formula. So if killing Snow doesn't end the games, what actually changes when you swap him for Coin? On the surface, no more rose-scented tyrant, no more televised arena. But here's the real question. Did Coin just invent Hope versus Fear 2.0, an update you'd actually agree to install? Back then, Snow's model is brutally simple. You have overt fear, peacekeepers in white armor, public whippings, and of course the Hunger Games themselves broadcast from the Capitol as appointment viewing. Then he threads this tiny glittering channel of hope through the horror. Win, and you're a victor with a mansion. Your district gets food, celebrations, a brief sense that the system can pay out if you play along. That part matters because it turns the games into a promise, not just a punishment. You don't just fear the Capitol ending your life, you hope the Capitol might improve it. So why is Coin more dangerous? Because she keeps the architecture and renovates the branding. This is where we talk about fear being renamed instead of removed. In District 13, control is framed as security protocols and necessary discipline. The strict schedules, the rations, the punishments for stepping out of line, on paper, they're about survival, not domination. At face value, that sounds reasonable. Who doesn't want to live through a war? But watch what she does with hope. Snow ties it to luxury and exception. You might become that one victor in a fancy house. Coin ties hope to morality, equality, justice, rebuilding a fair Panam. You're not promised a mansion. You're promised that your suffering has meaning. There is a lot to uncover here, because once you believe obedience equals goodness, you don't need peacekeepers on every corner. You'll schedule yourself. This is how she can phase out the visible games while keeping the underlying logic. Snow needs an arena on television. Coin just needs a narrative. When she authorizes those Capitol bombings that mirror Snow's tactics and kill Prim, she's already running a spiritual sequel to the games. Children sacrificed in a staged spectacle to break an enemy's will. The difference is, she calls it strategy, necessary, for the greater good. So why rebel against that, when the promise is a better future your pain will supposedly purchase? It's easy to unite a district against a man who poisons people at parties and decorates with blood. It's much harder to rise up against a woman standing at a podium saying, "We all have to do hard things." Who's the villain there? The leader or you for hesitating? Under Coin, Panem doesn't just obey, it internalizes. Citizens start policing each other for skipping drills, for questioning orders, for not matching the new moral standard. The relationship to power flips from "I'm scared of what they'll do to me" to "I'm scared of not being one of the good ones." That's Hope versus Fear 2.0, fear of chaos, hope of righteousness. So when Coin pitches a symbolic final games using Capitol children, it isn't a glitch in her system, it's the reveal. The old spectacle, dressed in the language of justice. The real question becomes, if Panem accepts that, what kind of president does Katniss become by saying yes or no in that vote? The final arrow, why Katniss chooses Coin over Snow, so when Coin pitches that symbolic final games, Katniss isn't just voting. She's loading the bow long before the balcony. Because here's the real question. Once you've agreed the games can come back in any form, what exactly are you protecting Prim's memory from? That brings us to the execution. The staging is not subtle. Coin is elevated high above the crowd, in Snow's old spot, flanked by new banners but the same stone. Snow is bound below, coughing blood, reduced to a prop. And Katniss is literally positioned between them, the supposed victor turned executioner, the instrument of justice connecting old power and new. At face value, you're supposed to aim where everyone expects. The tyrant who poisoned children, ordered bombings, turned your district into ash. But this is where we talk about visual symbolism during the real storytelling. Coin stands exactly where Snow once stood, looking down on Panem, framed by the ruins of the Capitol, as if they're just a new set for her broadcast. Different coat, same balcony. There is a lot to uncover here. Snow is already dying. His roses can't cover the blood anymore. His relationship with the Capitol elite is shattered, and his narrative control is gone. He's been exposed as the man who lost the war. Coin, on the other hand, is about to be sworn in with the promise of democracy, a clean election, and a future without games, right after she suggested one. So in that split second, what is Katniss actually weighing? She knows killing Snow is redundant. Nature and history are already doing that for her. The question becomes, who keeps the games alive in people's heads? The defeated monster on the ground, or the savior on the balcony who just tested whether the crowd would cheer for child sacrifice if you called it justice? That part matters because Katniss has seen this pattern before. The Capitol said the games were necessary to prevent chaos. District 13 says strict schedules, bombings, and propos are necessary to prevent the Capitol's return. Snow weaponized her as a threat. Coin weaponizes her as hope. Same tool. So when Katniss turns the arrow upward, she's not snapping. She's editing the story. She risks everything not to kill a dying old man, but to interrupt Coin at the exact moment her power would become uncontested, when the crowd is ready to transfer their fear and their faith to a new face on the same balcony. The aftermath is chaos, screaming, gunfire, Snow choking in the confusion. But the symbolic message lands cleaner than the shot. Justice is not about swapping who stands on the platform. It's about refusing the entire logic of the games, whether they're run by the Capitol, by District 13, or by anyone who promises safety in exchange for one more spectacle. So where does Panem go after that arrow falls? We're going to cover how the system tries to survive her choice next. Would Panem under Coin ever really end the games? So if Katniss kills Coin instead of Snow, and the crowd still cheers, what happens to the games after that? Do they really die with the old regime? Or do they just change costumes and keep walking? Because here's the real question. When Coin sells that symbolic final Hunger Games to the remaining victors, what is she actually promising? At face value, it sounds controlled, almost restrained. One time, limited to Capitol children. A necessary gesture before Panem can move on. She wraps it in the language of closure and balance, as if you can measure out suffering in equal portions and then declare the account settled. That part matters because power always loves exceptions. The Capitol said the original games were a one-time punishment after the dark days. A warning, a lesson. Then suddenly, it's tradition, it's culture, it's ratings. Once you accept that some children can be sacrificed for the greater good, how hard is it to find new greater goods when the next crisis hits? Food shortages, border skirmishes, a suspected uprising in some distant district. You can almost hear the speech, right? We don't want to return to the old games, but this is a special circumstance. So why wouldn't Coin, who already pushed through one symbolic arena, discover a second exception and a third? Not with the same branding, of course. She's smarter than that. This is where we talk about redecoration instead of demolition. Under Coin, the arena doesn't need to be called the Hunger Games. It can be a tribunal, a public trial, a voluntary punishment program for capital war criminals, where the cameras just happen to be rolling and every district is required to watch. You rename mutts as security measures, sponsors as citizen jurors, and suddenly the relationship between spectacle and justice feels reasonable. We've already seen her run the beta version. District 13's ProPod are edited suffering, packaged for maximum impact. Coin bombs children at the Capitol gates using Snow's double-tap tactic, then immediately exploits the chaos. That's not someone who sees public pain as horror, that's someone who sees it as a tool. So why would she throw away a proven tool once she's in charge? Notice she never argues that the games are wrong in principle. Her objection is about who's in the arena, who pays, who watches. When she proposes that final games, she's not slipping. She's revealing that retributive spectacle is still on the table, as long as she controls the script. So would Panem under Coin ever really end the games? The physical arena might close, the cornucopia might rust, but the logic of the games, public suffering as control and catharsis, would almost certainly survive under new branding. And the terrifying part is, people who survived Snow might actually feel grateful for the downgrade. So where does that leave Katniss, the one person who keeps refusing the script? We're going to cover how her refusal threatens not just one president, but the entire idea that pain can ever be good politics. The monster you see versus the monster you vote for. So where does that leave Katniss, the one person who keeps refusing the script? It leaves her standing between two presidents who are, on paper, enemies, but in practice, share the same addiction to control. This is where we talk about the monster you see versus the monster you vote for. Snow is the monster you see. He's the Capitol in human form, roses, blood, and televised executions. At face value, he doesn't pretend the games are fair. He doesn't pretend the districts are equal. His entire relationship with Panem is built on fear you can point to. The arena, the peacekeepers, the public whippings. Everyone knows the system is cruel. They're just too terrified, too hungry to ask why it's allowed to exist. Coin is different. Coin is the monster you vote for. She comes wrapped in the language of rebellion, councils, and collective decisions. She doesn't seize power in a coronation. She arrives through meetings, strategy sessions, symbolic votes. Remember that council where they vote on a final Hunger Games using capital children? That part matters because it's framed as shared responsibility. If Katniss and the other victors agree, then Coin isn't a tyrant. She's just honoring the will of the people, right? Here's the real question. Which monster is harder to get rid of long term? The one who openly tortures you, or the one who convinces you that you chose this? Snow's dictatorship runs on fear and spectacle. Coin's potential dictatorship runs on consent and exhausted relief. After years of bombings, starvation, and the games, a leader who promises order and necessary sacrifices sounds reasonable. When you believe you picked that leader, through a vote, through a rebellion, you're more likely to defend them even when they harm you. You explain away the rationing, the curfews, the secret prisons as temporary, survival, justice. Katniss has to learn this the hard way. She starts as the girl who only sees snow, the arena, the mutts, the roses on her dresser. That's her entire definition of evil. So she spends 2 books trying to kill the visible monster. But in District 13, she walks into another schedule on the wall, another set of cameras, another president who wants to turn her into a weapon. Coin keeps her alive only after Plutarch convinces her Katniss is more useful as a symbol than as a martyr. Sound familiar? It's Snow's logic with better branding. So why does this matter outside Panem? Because the story is quietly asking you to look past labels like liberator or revolutionary and pay attention to what leaders actually do with power once they have it. Do they dismantle the arena or just repaint it? Do they end the games or repackage them as symbolic justice? And when Katniss finally has 1 arrow and 2 presidents in front of her, who she chooses to kill, and why, completes that lesson in the most brutal way possible. But what if that choice wasn't about revenge at all and was something much colder? Pattern interrupt. Imagine 10 years of President Coin. So let's break the timeline for a second. Katniss draws the bow, but this time she does exactly what Coin expects. The arrow flies straight into Snow. He dies on schedule. The crowd roars on schedule, and Coin steps forward into the vacuum with that calm, reasonable voice, promising order after chaos. Now jump 10 years. What does Panem actually look like under President Coin? At face value, it looks better. The capital's been rebuilt, but the gold is gone. No more glittering gowns, no more fountains of purple punch. You get grey stone, efficient glass, clean lines. The central tower still looms over the city though. Different banner, same silhouette. That part matters because architecture is a memory device. Every time you look up, you remember there is one person at the top. Daily life, it runs on a schedule that would make District 13 proud. You wake up to mandatory civic broadcasts instead of Caesar Flickerman. Coin's face replaces Snow's roses. The games are over, but every morning you watch reconstruction updates and unity reports, where districts are praised for meeting quotas and shamed for falling behind. You don't spin a reaping ball anymore, but your name is still on a list. Rations are strict but fair. No one starves in District 12 now, but no one feasts in the capital either. On paper, that sounds perfect. Here's the real question. Who decides what fair is when the same person controls the food, the footage, and the story? Equality becomes another tool of control. Every year, there's a week of the rebellion. You're required to attend commemorations, stand through speeches, and answer little reflection questions on your handheld. They're framed as civic engagement, but they double as loyalty tests. Did you select the approved answer about Coin's necessary sacrifices? Did you hesitate? In a system built on surveillance, hesitation is its own crime. And if you do more than hesitate, you don't get a public whipping. You get a transfer, a quiet reassignment. Neighbors whisper that you moved to help with reconstruction in another district. Your room is cleared out by evening. There is a lot to uncover here in how Coin trades Snow's visible terror for invisible disappearance. This is where we talk about the children growing up in that world. Their history textbooks turned Snow into a cartoon monster and Coin into the woman who saved humanity. The double bombing of the capital children. It's written in one paragraph, framed as a tragic necessity that ended the war early and minimized overall loss of life. The moral isn't never again. It's trust the woman who made the hard call. So what happens to the victors in this timeline? They're still paraded when useful, rolled out every rebellion week to stand on stages and nod at carefully scripted questions. How does it feel to live in a Panem without games? They're asked, under the watchful eye of security. The relationship between victor and president hasn't disappeared. It's just rebranded from entertainment to education. Someone like Johanna, someone openly bitter, quietly stops appearing on broadcasts. Official story. Unofficial reality. Too unpredictable. Too honest. Beatty gets a lab and a budget, but his work never leaves Coin's control. He's the new head game maker in everything but name, designing surveillance instead of arenas. And Katniss? In the best case, she's tightly managed, married off, given a small house, filmed occasionally feeding geese, and talking about healing. In the worst case, an accident happens once her popularity dips or her trauma stops being useful. Coin never needed a free Katniss. She needed a symbol. Symbols are easier to handle when they're frozen in time. Here's the real question. In that 10-year future, did the games really end? Or did they just move off screen? Coin already floated the idea of a symbolic Hunger Games for capital children. In this timeline, that proposal passes. It's framed as justice, televised as catharsis, and archived as proof that the new Panem is willing to be honest about violence. Snow wanted control and didn't care if you hated him. Coin wants control and needs you to believe you chose her. That makes her harder to see, harder to fight, and much, much harder to remove once she's entrenched. So when Katniss releases that arrow into Coin instead, she isn't just killing one person, she's killing this entire decade we just walked through. She's cutting off a future where Panem trades an obvious monster for a cleaner, more efficient one with better branding. And that leaves us with a harder question. If you destroy the dictator and the replacement in one shot, what fills the vacuum after? Why Coin's Panem would be more stable, and that's terrifying. So if Katniss just erased both options in front of her, we have to ask, which future would have actually lasted longer? The answer is uncomfortable. Snow's Panem is brutal, but it's also fragile. Snow builds his entire system on the games and visible inequality. Every year, the capital turns children into spectacle, and every district watches its own kids die so the capital can drink champagne and place bets. It works, but only as long as people accept the trade, terror in exchange for a tiny, glittering promise of becoming a victor. The problem is, that bargain is loud, it's televised, it's impossible to ignore. This is where we talk about structural weakness. The capital's excess isn't just immoral, it's strategically stupid. The districts see the food, the fashion, the parties. Even thoughtful capital citizens see it. You can't miss the relationship between your child starving in District 11 and a stylist's banquet table groaning under desserts. That part matters because resentment has a target. It has a face, a smell, a color palette. Coin's version, much harder to aim at. District 13 runs on ideological discipline and shared hardship. Everyone eats the same grey rations, follows the same strict schedules, sleeps in the same concrete. At face value, it feels fair. You're not suffering so someone else can feast. You're suffering so everyone might survive. That's a completely different emotional story. And here's the real question. Who do you revolt against in a system that looks fair and calls itself justice? Coin doesn't flaunt wealth. She doesn't have roses or blood-scented breath. She has clipped speeches about survival and democracy, delivered from the same underground bunker you're standing in. Criticizing her starts to sound, even in your own head, like you're criticizing survival itself. We're going to cover why that's terrifying on a practical level. District 13 already has the institutions Snow would have killed for. The military is drilled down to the minute. Propaganda is professionalized through Plutarch and the Propos weaponizing Katniss's image with more precision than any arena. Resource distribution is logged, scheduled, audited. You see how easily that system scales when they start coordinating the districts during the war. Snow's control depends on the games airing every year and the illusion of capital invincibility. Once you bomb the arenas and crack the broadcasts, his spell breaks. But Coin's control depends on routines, rations, and a story about collective sacrifice. Those are much harder to topple because they feel necessary, especially after a war she can always threaten will return. So the reason Coin is more dangerous isn't that she's crueler in the moment, it's that her dictatorship would be cleaner, more efficient, and wrapped in the language of justice. A system that looks fair, feels necessary, and promises hope can endure far longer than one built on obvious decadence and fear alone. Which raises one last question. If that's the future Katniss kills, what exactly is she choosing instead? Katniss's final act, ending the games, not just the game makers. She has one arrow, one shot, and two presidents in front of her. At face value, you'd expect her to kill the man who murdered children on live television for decades. But here's the real question. Why does she aim past Snow and put that arrow straight through Coin instead? To get there, we have to remember what Katniss has been in everyone else's story. First, a tribute in the arena, then a victor forced to sell the romance narrative, then the Mockingjay, District 13's weaponized symbol. Every stage of her life, someone in power has treated her as a piece on the board. She survives, she rebels, but she's still playing their games. This is where we talk about the first move that isn't on anyone's script. Coin expects a clean coronation. Snow dies. She steps up. The crowd cheers. The cameras capture the transfer of power. It's a new games, just with a different kind of spectacle. Public execution instead of a bloodbath arena. Justice instead of entertainment. Same structure. By killing Coin in that exact moment, in front of the entire capital and the districts watching, Katniss rips the curtain down. She forces everyone to see the continuity between regimes. The woman promising freedom is the same woman who proposed a symbolic Hunger Games using capital children. The language changed. The logic didn't. And that part matters because of where Katniss is emotionally by then. She's lost Prim to a double bomb strategy that mirrors Snow's own tactics. She's almost lost Peter to torture and hijacking. She's watched rebels and peacekeepers use the same tricks, just with different flags. Any illusion that war produces clean heroes is gone. So when Coin casually suggests another round of games for revenge, Katniss hears the truth. Human lives are still tokens, still symbols, still expendable. So why not just kill Snow and hope Coin does better? Because Katniss finally understands the relationship between personality and system. Snow is the monster you can see. Coin is the system that can go on forever because it calls itself necessary. Her arrow is a refusal to endorse any leader who treats children as currency no matter which district they come from. And notice what her choice doesn't do. It doesn't install a perfect democracy. It doesn't hand the presidency to some morally pure victor. It creates a power vacuum, chaos, uncertainty. In the short term, that's terrifying. But it's the only move that stops Panem from sliding seamlessly into a more efficient, more permanent dictatorship under Coin. Symbolically, that's the end of the show. Katniss refuses to let the game's logic continue, whether it's televised arenas or symbolic executions. Her final act isn't just assassinating a person, it's assassinating the script. No tribute, no victor, no rebel has ever done that before. So where does Panem even go after someone kills the new president on live TV? Recap. 5 ways Coin was more dangerous than Snow. So where does Panem even go after someone kills the new president on live TV? To answer that, we have to zoom out and recap why Coin was, in many ways, a more dangerous threat than Snow. Because at face value, she's the woman who helped topple the Capitol. But here's the real question. What kind of world was she actually building behind that grey jumpsuit and for the district's branding? First, Coin hides her authoritarianism behind survival and justice. Snow never pretends he isn't in charge. The roses, the parties, the games all scream open tyranny. Coin, by contrast, wraps the same hunger for control in the language of ration lines and evacuation drills. Every schedule in District 13, every curfew, every punishment is framed as necessary for the war effort. That part matters because it makes her control socially acceptable. You're not obeying a dictator, you're being a good citizen who wants to survive. Second, she weaponizes propaganda as truth. Snow has the Hunger Games as his spectacle. Coin has propos. We're going to cover how both systems rely on turning a human being into a storyline. But notice the twist. Snow calls it entertainment. Coin calls it honesty. She stages Katniss in the hospital, in the rubble, in the field, then edits her into a symbol that fits District 13's narrative. The relationship between viewer and screen doesn't change. Only the logo in the corner does. Third, Coin's willingness to kill children proves she shares Snow's core belief in retributive spectacle. The double bomb strategy in the Capitol, authorized on her side. Prim's death is collateral she's willing to spend to break Snow and control Katniss. Then, when the dust settles, She proposes a symbolic final Hunger Games using capital children. That isn't justice. That's the same game's logic, repackaged as payback. Fourth, Coin uses the illusion of democracy to diffuse responsibility. Snow never asks for your vote. Coin calls a council, lets victors speak, and puts the final games to a vote. On paper, it's choice. In practice, it's pressure. If you go along, you're complicit. If you refuse, you're against the people. This is where we talk about why she needed Katniss to publicly endorse things, even when she planned to dispose of her later. A volunteered face makes the execution feel shared. Fifth, and maybe most chilling, Coin's system is more efficient and ideologically cohesive than Snow's ever was. The capital runs on decadence and fear. District 13 runs on discipline, belief, and a constant promise of future hope. A Coin-led Panem probably wouldn't collapse under its own excess the way Snow's did. It would stabilize. It would normalize. And that's exactly why Katniss has to stop her before the new games can begin. So if Katniss kills the more efficient dictator in waiting, what kind of power steps into the vacuum she just created? Your turn. Snow, Coin, and the leaders we trust. So when Katniss pulls that arrow up from Snow and onto Coin, you're dropped into that vacuum with her. If Snow is the monster you can see, and Coin is the monster you vote for, here's the real question. Who do you think is more dangerous in the long run? Is it Snow, the obvious tyrant whose roses reek of blood and poison? Or is it Coin, the righteous commander who uses the same tools, bombs, propaganda, necessary deaths, but sells them to you as order, justice, and hope? At face value, Snow feels easier to hate. You'd never mistake him for a savior. Coin's whole power comes from that confusion, from the way she turns a war president into a comforting promise. So put yourself in that war room for a second. Coin proposes a symbolic final Hunger Games using capital children. You get a vote. Are you a yes or a no? And more importantly, why? Do you feel that flash of satisfaction at the thought of Snow's world finally tasting its own medicine? Or does your stomach drop because you hear Snow's rules echoing in Coin's voice, just pointed at a different district this time? This is where we talk about your instinct for justice versus revenge. When you first read or watch that scene, did you nod along with Katniss voting yes, thinking, they deserve it? Or did it feel wrong immediately, a sign that the rebellion had already started to mirror the games it swore to end? There is a lot to uncover here in the relationship between pain and punishment, and the reason you lean one way or the other says something about what kind of leader you'd trust. And then we get to the real break point, Katniss's final decision. Do you agree with her choice to kill Coin, knowing it throws Panem back into uncertainty, with no clear president, no clear plan, just a dead victor of the political games on the balcony? Or would you have let Coin take power first and tried to reform her system from the inside? Which risk feels greater to you? A polished dictator with elections on paper, or a temporary power vacuum where anything could happen? I want to hear your version. If you were in Katniss's place, bow drawn, cameras rolling, where does your arrow go, and what's the one sentence you'd want the districts and the capital to remember? Use the comments as a kind of safe arena. The Hunger Games gives us a fictional capital, fictional districts, and fictional presidents. But the questions are real. Who do we put our faith in? When does propaganda become its own kind of weapon? Why are we more comfortable with certain kinds of control as long as they come with the right branding and a promise of stability? Share your take, respond to other people, but keep it respectful. Treat it the way Katniss wishes the games had been treated, as something we can finally step outside of and examine instead of just surviving. And if these moral and political deep dives into Panem are the kind of games you want to keep playing with us, you can always stick around, hit the support buttons, share this with another Hunger Games fan, and help keep this conversation going. Bonus speculation: the Panem that might have been. So let's cash in that promise from the roadmap and do the dangerous thing. What if Katniss had loosed the arrow we all expected and killed Snow instead? At face value, that sounds satisfying. The monster on the balcony dies, the crowd roars, the white roses finally wilt. But here's the real question. What kind of Panem walks away from that square if Coin lives to give her victory speech? In this alternate timeline, Coin gets exactly what she wants: a clean transfer of power. Snow dies as the official villain, Coin stands beside a traumatized Mockingjay, and the world sees a neat narrative. Old tyrant falls, new president rises. The games are abolished on day one. Huge gesture. Fireworks. Tears. But that part matters because you've seen this trick before. Ending the arenas doesn't mean ending the games. So what replaces them? Public tribunals. Broadcast sentencing. Truth and reconciliation events that somehow feature a lot of cages and cameras. Instead of children killing each other, you get Capitol peacekeepers paraded through the districts, forced to confess on live holo, then marched off to rehabilitation centers. No one ever tours twice. The spectacle stays. The targets change. The relationship between punishment and entertainment just gets rebranded as justice. There is a lot to uncover here when you zoom in by district. Take 1 and 2. Under Snow, they were the career pipeline, the place where volunteering was almost a sport. Under Coin, that history becomes original sin. Their victors, their trainers, even their merchants are suddenly the face of collaboration. You can imagine harsher rationing, mandatory service, and a permanent military presence to ensure reform. The symbol is flipped, but the control is tighter than ever. Meanwhile, poorer districts are handed front row seats and symbolic power. District 12 becomes the tragic hero district, wheeled out in every broadcast about resilience. District 11 is framed as the moral conscience of Panem. They get memorials, speeches, maybe slightly better grain shipments, but the real decisions, those stay buried under 13's concrete, on Coin's schedule boards, and in her war rooms. Hope is rationed, just like everything else. That's where the makeover turns brutal. Overnight, the decadent city becomes the model district of austerity. Mansions are converted into dormitories. Beauty salons become medical clinics. Former elites are assigned highly visible acts of contrition, cleaning rubble in grey uniforms, volunteering at food lines, standing in front of cameras to apologize to every district by name. It's not about healing, it's about teaching everyone what happens if you ever sit where they once sat. So where do our key characters land in this world? This is where we talk about the inner circle of Coin's new order. Gale, with his strategic mind and proven loyalty to 13, rises fast in the military hierarchy. He becomes the face of necessary hardness, the man who can explain on camera why harsh measures are unfortunate but rational. Peter, once rescued from hijacking, is repurposed yet again. Now he's the poster boy for healing and forgiveness, rolled out to hug repentant capital citizens and reassure the districts that unity is possible, as long as you follow Coin's plan. Haymitch? He gets a nice house, maybe even a renovated Victor's village somewhere, but the phone lines are always tapped. Officially, he's retired, a respected mentor of the revolution. Unofficially, he's a monitored asset, the man who knows too much about how symbols are made. You can almost see the schedule: weekly check-ins, surprise inspections, a quiet threat that his access to alcohol depends on good behavior, and Katniss herself, in this version, she's too valuable to kill and too dangerous to let disappear. Coin keeps her close at first. Ceremonies, speeches, a carefully managed relationship with Peter to sell the promise of national healing. But the second Katniss starts asking the wrong question. Why are the punishments still public? Why do the propon never stop? She's sidelined for her recovery, for the narrative. Here's the pattern interrupt. Coin never has to propose a symbolic final Hunger Games on capital children in this timeline. She doesn't need to. The threat of that suggestion lives under everything she does. You don't have arenas anymore, but you have something worse. A country trained to believe that watching people suffer on screens is a necessary part of staying free. So why does this matter, beyond the fun of alternate history? Because it shows how thin the line really is between liberation and rebranded control. Snow used the games to make fear visible. Coin would have used tribunals, rationing, and televised contrition to make obedience feel moral. One sells you survival, the other sells you virtue. Both end with you on a schedule you didn't write. And in a way, that's the final uncomfortable reason Coin is more dangerous than Snow. Snow's horror is obvious. You can point at the arena and say, that is wrong. Coin's horror is the kind you vote for, cheer for, and only question once it's already welded into the walls. In another Panem, the games never come back, but the game never ends. Closing reflection. Why Coin had to die for the story to mean anything? So here's the uncomfortable end point of that thought. If Coin lives, the story breaks. Because what actually changes? You swap white roses for grey jumpsuits. You trade a serpent in a greenhouse for a commander on a podium. But the arena stays. It just gets a new paint job and a better slogan. If Coin survives and rules, the trilogy quietly becomes a story about career advancement. One tyrant retires, the next victor of the political games takes the throne, and all of Katniss's suffering boils down to a regime change. That part matters because it would turn her into exactly what Snow wanted her to be, a weapon that secures the capital's power, just with a different flag over the building. Here's the real question. What is the point of 3 books about children being fed to a spectacle machine if we end with a more efficient spectacle machine? Coin's proposal for a symbolic final Hunger Games on capital children is the mask slipping. At face value, it sounds like justice. In reality, it's a promise that the structure is sacred. The only thing that rotates is who's on the menu. So when Katniss kills Coin instead of Snow, it feels messy, almost wrong. That's on purpose. This is where we talk about Suzanne Collins refusing the usual war story ending. There is no clean parade, no perfect election, no shot of a shining new constitution. There's a public execution that turns into an assassination, a dead tyrant choking on his own blood in the crowd, and a girl who doesn't even get a triumphant speech, just silence and sedation. There is a lot to uncover here. Coin's death doesn't magically fix Panem. District 13's schedules don't vanish. The trauma doesn't reset. We leave Katniss in a half-ruined Victor's village, raising children she was afraid to have, playing a private game of naming every horror and then answering. But there are games worse. The story refuses to give you the comfort of a perfect leader, because that's the exact fantasy that keeps producing people like Snow and Coin in the first place. And this loops back to why Coin is more dangerous than Snow. Snow is the obvious villain. He never pretends the games are anything but control dressed up as tradition. Coin represents the seductive idea that you can keep the same relationship to power as long as you rebrand it as justice or security or democracy. She's the promise that you can win the arena and then run it better. So the real victory was never killing Snow. It's that split second on the execution platform where Katniss recognizes the pattern and refuses to pull the trigger in the direction everyone expects. The win is seeing the coin on your own side and saying no. Because if you can do that once in Panem, the question the series leaves you with is painfully simple. Can you do it in your own world when the branding is even better? End screen. Keep the games going in a good way. So if you're still here, staring down Panem's power structure instead of closing the tab and pretending Coin was an upgrade, that already says something about you. You don't just want a villain, you want the pattern. And here's the real question as we wrap this up. If you can spot the relationship between Snow and Coin, what else in this world suddenly looks a little familiar? That part matters because once you see how easily a better capital rebrands the same arena, it's very hard to unsee it. If you want to keep pulling on that thread, we're going to cover a lot more than one president with a silver haircut. Check out the deep dives on how the original Hunger Games were designed as a political machine, why the arenas function as moving propaganda posters, and how Victor's village turns every winner into a permanent asset instead of a free citizen. At face value, it's real estate. Underneath, it's architecture as obedience training. If your brain is still in District 13, there is a lot to uncover here too. We've got breakdowns on bunker culture, the schedules, the punishments, and why their grey jumpsuits might be even more honest than the capital's neon excess. Was that freedom, or just austerity with better speeches? You can jump straight from this execution platform into those videos next. And if you're more character-focused, this is where we talk about Katniss, Peter, and Snow as three different responses to the same rigged games. There are full character studies waiting for you, how a victor is manufactured, how a symbol is used, and why Snow's roses are basically scented press releases. If this coin analysis hit something in you, those are going to feel like the extended cut. Share this one with the friend who still swears Snow is the main villain and thinks Coin was just practical. You know, the one who always volunteers to defend the lesser evil at debate night? Hand them this as fuel for the next Hunger Games argument and see what happens when they get to the part about the symbolic final games on Capitol children. If you want more long-form, lore-heavy breakdowns of Panem's politics, symbolism, and the way all of this reflects our own world, you know what to do with the channel. We're going to keep asking why these stories were built this way and what they're quietly warning us about. Seriously, thank you for spending this much time in our own little Victor's village, walking through fictional dictatorships instead of, sleeping or doing something wholesome. It means you're willing to sit with uncomfortable questions, and that's rarer than any mansion on a hill. So as you head to the next video, keep this in the back of your mind. Be very suspicious of anyone who promises peace, but insists on keeping their hand on the arena controls.